When Saint Faustina speaks about what the soul realizes after death, she isn't describing something abstract or distant. She's pointing straight at the heart of our everyday lives, the ones we're living right now while folding laundry, sitting in traffic, worrying about emails, and wondering whether any of it really matters. What the soul comes to understand, she tells us, is that earthly life was not a waiting room for eternity. It was the moment. It was the arena. It was the only place where love could be chosen freely, where mercy could be practiced in the middle of imperfection, where faith could exist without certainty. And after death, that truth becomes unmistakably clear. Here's the part that stops people in their tracks. The soul realizes that life on earth was brief, fragile, and unbelievably important all at once. Not important in the way we're usually taught to measure importance, success, productivity, recognition, but important because every breath was a chance to love. Every ordinary day was filled with quiet invitations from God, and most of those invitations came disguised as interruptions, inconveniences, or moments that felt too small to matter. The soul sees that nothing was wasted by God, even when we wasted it ourselves. Saint Faustina writes that in eternity, the soul understands that time was the greatest treasure it ever possessed. Time to forgive, time to trust, time to choose humility over pride, compassion over indifference, courage over comfort. On earth, we experience time as something we're always running out of, something we try to control or escape. But after death, time is revealed as the sacred space where love was meant to grow. And the soul sees, with painful clarity and gentle honesty, just how often it rushed past that space without noticing it. What's especially striking is that the soul doesn't suddenly regret not being richer, more admired, or more powerful. That's not the ache Saint Faustina describes. The ache comes from realizing how many chances there were to love more deeply, and how often fear or distraction got in the way. The soul sees that the moments it thought were insignificant were actually the ones that echoed into eternity. A patient response, instead of a sharp word. A hidden sacrifice no one noticed. A prayer whispered through exhaustion. A decision to stay when it would have been easier to leave. These were the moments that carried weight. And this is where the message becomes both sobering and strangely hopeful. Because Saint Faustina reminds us that God does not measure life the way the world does. The soul realizes after death that heaven was not impressed by busyness, achievements, or appearances. What mattered was love, real love, lived out in real circumstances, often quietly, often imperfectly. The soul understands that holiness was never about being extraordinary, it was about being faithful in the ordinary. And suddenly, the ordinary doesn't look ordinary at all. There's a kind of holy shock that happens in this realization. The soul sees how much of life was spent striving for things that couldn't last, while the most enduring treasures were offered daily and often ignored. And yet, this realization isn't cruel. It's honest. Saint Faustina's revelations don't portray God as standing at the end of life with a checklist and disappointment. They show God as a loving presence who had been walking alongside the soul all along, offering grace in countless small ways, waiting patiently for trust. What the soul understands is that earth was the only place where faith could exist without full sight. In eternity, everything becomes clear. But on earth, faith required vulnerability. It required choosing to believe without guarantees, to love without knowing how it would be received, to give without assurance of return. The soul realizes that this vulnerability was not a weakness. It was the very thing that made love meaningful. After death, the soul sees that every act of faith carried a depth that could only exist because certainty was absent. Saint Faustina emphasizes that suffering too is reinterpreted after death. On earth, suffering often feels like evidence of abandonment or failure. But the soul realizes that suffering, when united with love, became a powerful offering. Not because suffering itself was good, but because it created space for compassion, surrender, and trust. The soul sees that some of the most fruitful moments of life were the ones that felt the most barren at the time. The tears that fell in secret, the prayers that felt unanswered, the endurance that no one applauded. These moments were not overlooked. There's also a deep awareness that love was always available, even in the messiest parts of life. The soul realizes that it didn't need a perfect situation to choose love. It needed presence, It needed willingness. It needed the courage to stay open when closing off would have felt safer. And here's the hard truth. Saint Faustina doesn't soften. The soul sees that love was often postponed. Later, it said, when things calm down, when I'm less tired, when they apologize first. And after death, later is gone. Yet even in this realization there is no despair. There is clarity, yes, and sometimes sorrow, but not the kind that crushes. It's the kind that teaches. The soul understands that God was never asking for perfection. God was asking for participation, for a heart that tried, that returned, that kept choosing love again after failure. The soul sees that even its smallest efforts mattered, especially when they were made with sincerity. One of the most moving insights Saint Faustina offers is that the soul recognizes how closely God was involved in its daily life. Not just in dramatic moments, but in the quiet ones. God was present in conversations that felt forgettable, in decisions that seemed routine, in struggles that felt personal and hidden. After death, the soul sees that grace was woven through everything. It was offered in moments of restlessness, in sudden nudges toward kindness, in discomfort that invited growth. Nothing was random. And here's where this message becomes deeply personal for us, right now. Because if the soul only realizes the true value of earthly life after death, then the invitation is clear. We don't have to wait. We can live with that awareness now. We can begin to see our days not as obstacles to endure, but as sacred ground. We can stop waiting for our lives to become meaningful and start recognizing that meaning is already here, asking for our attention. Saint Faustina's message gently confronts our habit of underestimating ourselves and our lives. We often believe that what we're doing doesn't count because it's not visible, not celebrated, not impressive. But the soul learns that love doesn't need an audience to be eternal. The things we do when no one is watching often carry the most weight. The soul sees that God noticed everything and valued it far more than we did. After death, the soul also understands that relationships were central, not accessories, not distractions from a more spiritual life. Relationships were the curriculum, the difficult ones, the tender ones, the ones that stretched patience and demanded forgiveness. The soul sees that every interaction was an opportunity to grow in love or retreat into self-protection. And the choices made in those moments shape the soul more than any external accomplishment ever could. There's a profound sense that life on earth was a gift wrapped in limitation. The soul understands that limitations, time, energy, knowledge, weren't flaws in the design. They were what made love possible, because love chosen under limitation is love that cost something. And that cost, the soul realizes, is what gave love its depth. Saint Faustina's revelations invite us to stop rushing past our own lives, to stop numbing ourselves to the present moment, to stop believing that what we're living through now is just a prelude to something more meaningful later. The soul realizes after death that this was it. This was the place where eternity was shaped, moment by moment, choice by choice. And so the message lands softly but firmly. Pay attention to the people in front of you, pay attention to the nudges toward kindness, pay attention to the moments that feel small because they are not. The soul learns that earth was not a trial run, it was the gift. So if there's one truth that echoes from Saint Faustina's revelations, it's this. Your life matters more than you think, right now, exactly as it is. The soul realizes how much of life was lived on autopilot. Not because it didn't care, but because it was overwhelmed, tired, afraid, or simply unaware. On earth, we are experts at staying busy enough to avoid silence, busy enough to avoid discomfort, busy enough to avoid asking the deeper questions about who we're becoming and what we're numbing ourselves to. And after death, the soul sees that busyness was not neutral. It was costly. Not because rest is wrong or enjoyment is wrong, but because distraction became a way of avoiding the invitations God kept offering. Saint Faustina reveals that the soul recognizes how often grace appeared quietly and was dismissed just as quietly. Grace didn't always arrive as a dramatic call or a thunderous sign. More often it came as a subtle nudge, a moment of conscience, a restlessness that whispered, "This isn't working," a chance to reconcile, a tug toward prayer, a moment when love asked for courage instead of comfort. and the soul sees how often those moments were postponed, ignored, or overridden by fear. What's haunting about this realization is not that the soul failed, it's that the soul sees how reachable transformation actually was. The distance between who we were and who we were called to be wasn't as wide as it felt. Grace had already crossed most of that distance. God had already moved toward us again and again. The soul realizes that change didn't require a total overhaul of life. It required small, brave choices made consistently. And so the sorrow comes not from impossibility, but from proximity. On earth, we tend to believe that someday we'll become more patient, more generous, more prayerful, when things settle down, when we feel more ready, when we're less afraid. The soul realizes after death that someday was a myth that kept love safely postponed. There was always something else that felt more urgent. Another deadline, another responsibility, another excuse that sounded reasonable at the time. And only in eternity does the soul see that love doesn't wait for perfect conditions. Love grows in the middle of imperfection, or not at all. Saint Faustina's insights reveal that the soul understands how often it chose comfort over growth. Not because comfort is evil, but because it became a hiding place, a way to avoid vulnerability, a way to stay in control. The soul sees how many moments called for courage, courage to apologize, courage to forgive, courage to change direction, and how often fear won. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being rejected, fear of facing one's own wounds. And the soul realizes that fear, left unchallenged, slowly shaped a life. There is a deep awareness too of how grace was misunderstood. On earth, we often imagine grace as something dramatic, something rare, something reserved for the deeply holy or the deeply broken. But after death, the soul realizes that grace was woven into daily life. It was present in second chances, in discomfort that invited growth, in consequences that tried to teach rather than punish, in moments of longing that pointed towards something deeper. Grace was persistent, relentless, and remarkably patient. The soul also sees how often it resisted grace because grace required letting go of resentment, letting go of self-importance, letting go of familiar patterns, even when those patterns were painful. Grace threatened the stories we told ourselves about who we were and what we deserved. And so the soul recognizes that resistance didn't come from rebellion as much as from self-protection. But self-protection left unchecked became a barrier to love. One of the most painful realizations Saint Faustina describes is how often love was delayed because of pride. Pride that insisted on being right. Pride that refused to ask for help. Pride that demanded recognition before offering kindness. After death, the soul sees that pride didn't make it strong, it made it smaller. It narrowed the heart, it limited connection. And grace was always waiting on the other side of humility, patiently, without forcing its way in. There's also a sober recognition of how easily we learn to live divided lives. On earth, we compartmentalize. Faith in one box, work in another, relationships in another. We tell ourselves that God understands our inconsistencies, and of course God does. But the soul realizes after death that wholeness was always the invitation. Integration, living from the same values everywhere, not just when it was convenient. Grace was offered to help us become whole, not perfect, but we often settled for functional. The soul sees how often it silenced its own conscience, not all at once, slowly, one compromise at a time, one rationalization at a time. And what once felt uncomfortable eventually felt normal. The soul realizes that grace tried to interrupt that process repeatedly, through unease, through dissatisfaction, through moments of longing that didn't make sense. But instead of listening, the soul often chose noise, entertainment, activity, anything to avoid stillness, because stillness made the truth harder to ignore. Saint Faustina emphasizes that this realization is not about tallying failures, it's about seeing patterns, patterns of avoidance, patterns of delay, patterns of choosing what felt easy over what was meaningful. And the soul understands that these patterns didn't appear overnight. They formed through repeated small choices, and that's what makes the realization so sobering. If small choices shaped a life away from grace, small choices could have shaped it toward grace too. The soul also recognizes how often it underestimated the cost of inaction. On earth, we tend to think that harm comes only from what we do wrong. But after death, the soul sees the weight of what it failed to do. Words of encouragement left unsaid. Help withheld because it felt inconvenient. Truth avoided because it felt uncomfortable. The soul realizes that love requires movement, and staying still in moments that called for action had consequences. There's a particular tenderness in the way Saint Faustina describes God's response to all of this. God is not surprised. God is not bitter. God is not tallying missed chances with cold detachment. God is present, even in the soul's regret, with the same mercy that was offered during life. And yet, the soul understands that time, the space for choosing, has ended, not as punishment but as reality. Earth was the place of becoming, and becoming requires time. What makes this realization transformative rather than crushing is that the soul finally sees itself truthfully, not as it wished to be seen, not as it feared it was, but as it truly was, loved, invited, hesitant, capable of more. The regret that arises is not rooted in shame, but in recognition. Recognition of potential. Recognition of missed intimacy with God. Recognition of how close grace always was. And here's the invitation that echoes back to us now, while we still have breath. We don't have to wait for death to see clearly. We don't have to wait for regret to become our teacher. Saint Faustina's revelations are not meant to paralyze us with fear, but to awaken us with honesty, to help us notice where we are numb. Being ourselves, delaying love, or resisting change that grace is gently inviting. Because the truth is, grace is still appearing in our lives the same way it always has, quietly, persistently, patiently, in moments of discomfort that ask us to grow, in relationships that challenge our defenses, in restlessness that refuses to let us settle for less than we were made for. And unlike the soul after death, we still have time to respond. So the question isn't whether grace will come, it already has. The question is whether we will stop long enough to notice it, and brave enough to say yes today. There is a moment Saint Faustina describes that changes the entire way we understand mercy, and it's not dramatic in the way we expect. There's no thunder, no spectacle, no divine anger breaking through the clouds. Instead, there is clarity, the kind of clarity that arrives when all the noise falls away and nothing remains but truth. After death, the soul realizes something astonishingly simple and overwhelmingly profound. Mercy was always within reach. What the soul sees is not a God who was distant or withholding, but a God who was relentlessly near, near in ways that were easy to miss, near in invitations that felt ordinary, near in second chances that looked like interruptions. The soul realizes that mercy was not a rare event reserved for the worst moments or the most desperate prayers. Mercy was the atmosphere of life itself. It surrounded every failure, every fear, every unfinished attempt to love. On earth, we tend to imagine mercy as something we have to earn or something we only qualify for once we've fallen far enough. We treat it like a last resort. But after death, the soul understands that mercy was the starting point, not the backup plan. God did not wait for perfection. God waited for honesty. God waited for openness. God waited for trust. And those doors were never locked from the divine side. Saint Faustina reveals that the soul sees how often it misunderstood mercy. It thought mercy meant excusing weakness or ignoring responsibility. It feared that accepting mercy meant admitting failure or losing control. And so the soul often tried to fix itself first, to be better first, to deserve mercy before asking for it. Only after death does the soul realize how backward that thinking was. Mercy was not the reward for change. Mercy was the fuel for change. There is a tenderness in this realization that is almost unbearable. The soul sees how many moments it stood at the edge of grace, hesitating, moments when repentance stirred quietly in the heart, moments when humility knocked softly, moments when surrender would have brought peace, but pride, fear, or shame held the door shut, and the soul understands that mercy never withdrew. It waited, patiently, without resentment, without pressure. What becomes painfully clear is that God's mercy was not fragile. It did not disappear after repeated failures. It did not grow tired of being offered again and again. The soul realizes that God's mercy outlasted every excuse, every delay, every self-justifying story. Even when the soul turned away, mercy remained oriented toward it, not chasing, not forcing, but always facing it. The soul also understands that mercy was deeply personal, not generic, not distant. God's mercy met the soul exactly where it was, not where it pretended to be. Mercy accounted for wounds, for history, for limitations, for fear. It was never blind to the truth, but it was never afraid of the truth either. And this is where the soul feels the weight of realization. Nothing needed to be hidden, nothing needed to be protected from God. On earth, shame convinces us that being seen will lead to rejection. So we curate, we minimize, we present the acceptable parts of ourselves and keep the rest carefully guarded. After death, the soul sees how unnecessary that guarding was. God already knew, God already understood. And mercy was never conditional upon performance. It was offered precisely in the places of weakness we tried hardest to conceal. Saint Faustina's revelations show that the soul recognizes how mercy appeared in countless forms, in the voice of conscience that urged honesty, in the discomfort that followed harmful choices, in the longing for something deeper that success couldn't satisfy, in the people who offered forgiveness we didn't think we deserved, in the quiet resilience that carried us through moments we thought would break us. Mercy was never abstract, it was embodied in daily life. And the soul sees how often it confused mercy with permission to stay the same. It feared that accepting mercy would mean settling into mediocrity or avoiding responsibility. But after death, the soul understands that mercy always carried an invitation to grow, to heal, to become more whole. Mercy never minimized the truth. It created safety to face the truth without being destroyed by it. There is also a profound recognition that mercy respected freedom. God did not coerce the soul into choosing love. God did not override will or force surrender. Mercy waited for consent, and the soul realizes that many times it withheld that consent, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of change, fear of letting go, fear of who it might become if it fully trusted mercy. One of the most striking realizations Saint Faustina describes is that mercy was available even in the final moments of life, even when strength was gone, even when clarity was fading, even when words failed. Mercy did not depend on eloquent prayer or perfect repentance. It depended on a turning of the heart, however small, a glance, a sigh, a whisper of trust, and the soul sees that God was attentive even then. Yet this realization is not meant to romanticize delay. The soul understands that while mercy was always available, time was still precious. Mercy did not erase the consequences of choices or the missed opportunities to love more fully. Mercy healed, but it also revealed what could have been. And that knowledge carries both comfort and ache. Comfort, because mercy was real. Ache, because it was often postponed. What's remarkable is that the soul does not experience this realization as condemnation. It experiences it as truth spoken in love. A love so steady that it can hold both mercy and responsibility without contradiction. The soul understands that God's mercy was not opposed to justice. It fulfilled it. Justice named reality. Mercy redeemed it. And here's where this truth turns toward us, now, in this moment. Because Saint Faustina's revelations are not about what happens only after death. They are about what is true right now. Mercy is still within reach. Not someday. Not once we get ourselves together. Not once we feel worthy. Mercy is as close as honesty, as close as surrender, as close as a simple, unguarded yes. We often wait for a crisis to take mercy seriously. We wait until we're desperate, broken, or out of options. But the soul realizes after death that mercy was meant to be a daily relationship, not an emergency measure. A way of living open, responsive and humble. A way of staying soft in a world that teaches us to armor up. Saint Faustina's message invites us to stop treating mercy like a concept and start experiencing it as a presence that meets us in our inconsistency, a presence that doesn't flinch at our mess, a presence that keeps inviting us forward even when we stumble backward. Mercy is not fragile. It can hold our fear, our doubt, and our resistance without withdrawing. The soul also understands that trusting mercy required courage. It meant letting go of self-reliance, letting go of the illusion that we could save ourselves through effort or control. Mercy asked for vulnerability, the willingness to be loved without earning it. And that vulnerability was terrifying on earth because it felt like exposure. After death, the soul sees that it was actually freedom. What Saint Faustina makes clear is that mercy does not diminish the soul, it enlarges it. It creates space for growth, space for healing, space for transformation that force could never accomplish. And the soul realizes that every time it accepted mercy, even briefly, it became more itself, not less. There is also an awareness that mercy was offered not just for personal healing, but so it could be extended outward. The soul sees how receiving mercy softened it toward others, how refusing mercy hardened it. Mercy was meant to move through the soul, not stop there. And after death, the soul understands how much the world needed that flow of mercy, how many wounds could have been met differently if mercy had been trusted more deeply. Saint Faustina's revelations leave us with a choice, not a threat, a choice to believe that mercy is real and available now, a choice to stop postponing repentance, forgiveness, or surrender, a choice to trust that God is not waiting to reject us, but waiting to receive us. Because the soul's final realization is not that it was unworthy of mercy, but that mercy was always ready, and love was always asking to be chosen.